is the long-range nature, why things happen, why mistakes are made, how we manage to muddle into a war. Tactical is the actual fighting. So when I think about the Korean War, what I really think about is the tactical, because that was the traumatic. I was wounded 3 times, and I have what I euphemistically call my share of young men's medals. The kind you get when you're young, you don't get when you're older, because you think you're going to live forever, or because circumstances compel you to do something that in retrospect wasn't the best choice or the best course of action. I remember one time in a firefight, I was very angry because my people were getting knocked down by a machine gun. And I was kind of on the flank. So I said something of I was swearing at the machine gunner. And my men were falling. So I decided it was time to do something about it. So I went after him. And later on, I said to my platoon sergeant, I said, pardon me. I said, Pappy, why didn't you stop me? He said, I couldn't catch you. I said, well, we'll fix that and put a tether on my boot. That was one of the dumbest things I ever did. Fortunately, it worked out, and I was able to silence the problem. But those are the things that, one of the things I found out about myself. When I first got there, I talked to my first platoon sergeant, was named John Deason. It's funny, in the military, you always remember the John Deason from Shelbyville, Tennessee. And he had been there for a while, 4 months. And I said, John, I haven't been in action. I haven't been in a firefight. If I show cowardice and I run, I want you to shoot me, because I don't want to live as a coward. And he said, sir, that won't happen. I said, well, how do you know? He said, because you asked. What I did find out was that during an actual firefight, I became as cool as you could be. And I was rock steady. Now, after a firefight, when we're back in the bunker and we're having a cup of ersatz coffee, I couldn't drink it because my hand was shaking and I was spilling it all over me. And that would go on for a while, and then you calm down and you're all right. But during an actual firefight, I found that I was very calm and I saw everything in slow motion. I have, this is really a hodgepodge. I start off with every war has its own kind of hell. In Korea, the summers were hot, the winters were brutal. There are times when I thought that I would never get warm again. And we constantly, I would walk up and down the line as a platoon leader. You have about 40 people, at least initially. Or as a company commander, you start off with 206. One time, after one battle, we were down to 27. So it got a little hectic. But I did find that for some reason, for which I'm grateful, I was calm during the firefight, and then would come unstuck afterwards. But here, this is a hodgepodge. It doesn't mean anything to anyone, but I could explain. But why don't we start then? That's kind of a preface to the whole thing. But why don't we start with your questions, and I'll kind of mentally see what I'm doing here, and then if there's anything that I think that might be relevant. But this really, this is these are words and phrases that I thought about in Japan after I was out of the fighting. But all of my time in the Army was in the infantry and later airborne infantry. But I did go to jump school kind of late in life, and that's another story which has nothing to do with the Korean War. But I found it to be a great experience. Going through jump school at the age of 50 was unique. They don't cut you any slack, but when you manage to overcome everything involved in that, you feel pretty good about it. It's like you having a goal and you're not sure you're going to be able to attain it. And then when you reach it, there's a, hey, that's pretty good. I did that. And that's why some people like to skydive or do rock climbing or do something of a quasi-hazardous nature. To me, the Army had assigned a battalion of Special Forces to my division. And the only way I could go with them was to parachute with them, because theoretically, when they go into an operation, they go into what's called isolation. And if you land a helicopter, you compromise the location because someone can track that. So you have to go up high and jump in. And so to be able to exercise command and control over that new battalion, I decided to go through jump school. And it was a good experience. And I lost a few pounds in the process, but I did it. Okay, you have questions.
Sure. Just for the sake of the recording, I'm going to say that this is for History 375, World History, Korean and Vietnam War. My name is Christina Busk. This is for Professor Ritchie's class. And can you state just your name?
My name is Dan Helix. I'm a resident of Concord. I'm retired military. I had 41 years in the Army. Started off as a private and retired as a major general. Enjoyed all of my time was in the infantry, and against some in the airborne element, which is not a big deal. It's just another way to go to work. But I think there's a lot of spirit involved, and I tend to evaluate people who had that inch and a half of silver on their shirt or their blouse as being someone that I knew would go out the door. And not everyone will go out the door. So I, as a military person, would tend to give a little more credence to someone that I knew had that experience. But also, there were many people that served in my division that did not do that, that performed in an excellent way. Entered federal service from the Presidio of San Francisco when I was 18 after high school. I remember my first physical. The doctor looked at my feet and said, "Son, you're in the infantry." I wasn't quite sure what that meant, but it was okay with me. And then went through basic training at Fort Ord, which is now not a military post, but still a beautiful location. And then different assignments until the Korean War broke out, and I was called in, and it was suggested that I go to Officer Candidate School at Fort Benning, Benning School for Boys. It's the infantry school. That's where you get infantry lieutenants, other than West Point. West Point, of course, is the premier military school. And I think that when I think of the various military academies, the Air Force Academy in Annapolis, West Point, and the young men and women that go there, I really think, as I've observed, that they're among America's finest young people. So I think we're privileged. But during time of war, you need combat leaders. I remember at OCS, our final exam, we were taken out into the woods and given a period of 3 days to get back. And we had all sorts of obstacles. And I looked at one exam and I said to a buddy, I said, "If you become a lieutenant colonel, you have maxed out what they expect of you for OCS." He said, "How do you know?" I said, "Look at the question. It says you are Lieutenant Colonel, 1st Battalion. If you go to West Point, your final exam is you are Commanding General of 52nd Mech Division. So if you become a colonel, you have maxed out what they expect of you." And in actuality, I'm the only one in my OCS class who became a general officer. So I was fortunate to have mentors who brought me along, who made sure that I went to certain schools, Command General Staff College, the War College, which were some of the suggested, if not mandatory, test for becoming a general officer. So, let's see, well, I think I've answered the question.
Thank you. So what year did you end up going over to Korea, and for how long were you there?
I was in Korea in December of '51. And by the way, the Korean War was 37 months from June 25th of 1950 to July 27th of 1953. It started when 100,000 North Koreans, equipped by the Russians with their artillery and tanks, crossed the line. Korea, as a country, had not been divided. This was a strategic, tactical mistake, and it came about because the Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, in 1949 in giving a speech in Washington, D.C., had indicated that Korea was not in our sphere of influence. And in other words, we won't fight to retain that. And that was the wrong message, because when the North Koreans, equipped by the Soviet Union, did cross the line, President Truman decided that we would have to intervene. And we were so unprepared. That period of time from World War II, 1945, and some of that is addressed in a paper, till 1950. The military got fat, got lazy. They weren't training. They didn't expect to get in a war. So the ones who were thrown into the battle became the surrogates of our unpreparedness, and they paid a very steep price. There's a group called Task Force Smith, which was one of the first battalions to encounter the enemy, and they were pretty much demolished because we were not ready. And finally, when we were driven to what is called the Pusan Perimeter, a small area around Pusan, MacArthur, who was the commander-in-chief, was able to prevail and get some forces. And some of the reference is made to that. Again, that's those things are strategic. They're not the actual day-to-day fighting. There's a great book called The Things They Carry, which has to do with the Vietnam War. It's an outstanding book. I'm sorry I can't think of the author's name right now, but it has to do, would you get me a Kleenex?
Certainly.
It has to do with the day-to-day living of the grunts. And I was a grunt, infantryman. You don't ride, you walk. And you live a different kind of a life. My first reaction when I first got to Korea, was climbing a hill. And there was a young sergeant who came down to the reverse slope of the hill to meet me, to be my guide. So I went up the hill like a goat or an animal would. I zigzagged, so it wouldn't be a steep climb. Within 1 month, I could start at the bottom and run straight up the hill. I also dropped 40 pounds. I went from 190 to 150, but it was a hard 150. You lived in a dirt bunker. You carved out the bunker and you had a shelf, and then you'd put some kind of a tarp, then a row of logs, and then a row of sandbags, then another crisscross row of logs, more sandbags, and if you're lucky, more logs, sandbags, then dirt. And that would withstand most artillery. It wouldn't penetrate down through that. And that's how you lived. And your illumination was by candles. And your you communicated between bunkers with they call sound power telephones. You would ring, they had battery operated, or at nighttime to avoid the ring and making noise, you would take the head of a bullet and tap on the voice part, and so they would hear that, and that's how you communicated. And of course, you had radios, but most of it was sound power connected by wires, and frequently artillery would come in and take out the wires. You'd have to rewire. But that's the way you communicated. The food was sea rations or sea rats. They had 4 or 5. They're a long way from meals ready to eat. The MREs, or meals ready to eat, they have today can go up to 10,000 calories. These were a lot less. There was one that I liked, beans and franks, so I would sometimes exercise my authority as the platoon commander or company commander. So when they opened up a new case of sea rats, give me a can of bean and franks. You took a shower once a month, whether you needed it or not, and that was the quartermaster would set up a shower unit on the reverse slope of the hill, and you'd go down there, and you'd enter and take off your clothes and throw them in a container. Go through, take a shower, and they give you a clean uniform, and you're ready to go. It was a great feeling, just to have civilization that way. Otherwise, during the week, you would take your helmet and warm up the water and take a bath in the bunker as best you could. Because when you have 3 or 4 people living in close proximity, hygiene is a problem. As a platoon leader, we would go on a patrol every 3rd night. And every 3rd night you go out and your job is to get in a fight. Sometimes you would go out and set up an and wait, or if division wanted to know precisely who we're facing, you would make contact and you would bring back a uniform or something which identified the opposition so they could track who we were fighting. That caused me a bit of a problem because at Berkeley High School I played sports, and I also boxed. But other than that, I wasn't really interested in fighting. So the idea that you're compelled every 3rd night to go out and try to kill someone and keep from being killed was a different experience. That caused me a problem when I got home with the VA, because I was sent into a room and a fellow said, "Do you know why you're here?" I said, "No." And he said, "Well, you don't know why you're here?" "No." He had a handheld mic, and he said, "He says he doesn't know why he's here." And then he kept talking. He talked for about 2 minutes. And I said, "I gave you a 1-word answer. What are you saying into that thing?" He said, "He wants to know, my chair went flying back and I went over the top of the desk The guy was screaming, "Stop, stop, I'm just doing my job." I said, "You've got a hell of a job. What is it?" He said, "I'm supposed to show you have a boiling point of 0 because of your combat." I said, "I already knew that." He said, "Please, I'm just doing my job." And anyway, I talked to the VA since then, and I said, "You need to revise your way of approaching people who have been in combat. They don't understand when you act like that." But that was our job every third night, to go out and get in a fight. We didn't always make contact, but we did a lot of times. Division was always lusting for prisoners, and if you were able to get a live prisoner, you would get a reward of 5 days R&R in Japan, which was really great. I remember my first day in R&R, I went to a department store, 5 stories, and I walked every floor. I looked at everything. I wanted to see civilization. I wanted the reassurance that there was the life that I left back home was still there. And I walked that entire department store, floor by floor. Didn't buy anything. I just wanted to see what was there. But because the people who come back are not the same ones who went over. And I frequently counsel veterans, and I say, when you experience feelings of anger, don't take it out on your spouse or your children. I want you to call me or call the vet center because you need help. Because you are not the same person who went to war. Some of the battles that I was in are infamous. Old Baldy, T-Bone Hill, Pork Chop Hill, Alligator Jaw, Jane Russell Hills, for the obvious reason. The Wodunji Finger. We had an advantage in a firefight because we had giant searchlights. We called them moonbeam. They were on huge scaffolds, and they would kind of quasi-illuminate the battlefield. Americans were not naturally given to fighting at night. They prefer to fight in the daytime when they can see things. And the Koreans and the Chinese knew this. So they would fight at night. Now, the amazing thing is that at night you can develop a kind of night vision where you can really begin to see things. And that's why you avoid any illumination. And before a patrol, we would start in a location where we would become attuned to the darkness. But then when Moonbeam came in, that was huge because you could at least see shadows, and that helped. A typical combat patrol, I had a platoon of start off about 40 guys, usually about 35. And we might have 18 people. So we'd have a machine gun with 4 boxes of ammunition, that's 1,000 rounds. This is before the M16. We had M1 rifles, so I would have my guys exchange their M1 rifle for someone with an M2 carbine. An M2 carbine is a smaller round, but most of your firefights were within 50 to 100 yards. So you don't need a rifle that can fire 5,000 yards. you need something with more firepower. So on a patrol, most of my people would have, in effect, automatic weapons. So this was a big advantage because every one of us had grenades and plenty of ammunition. As the platoon leader, I carried fewer rounds than anyone, but I carried about 300 rounds. That's a lot of ammo for most of the patrols. Firefights of a longer nature became a problem. But the Chinese, who we fought primarily, were very good fighters, but only 1 in 3 was armed. The others would carry bags of grenades. They were not fragmentation, where our grenades were fragmentation. So the metal breaks up and becomes deadly. They were concussion. They could knock you out. They could disable you. But they would carry these, and they had rings, and they would maybe throw 3 or 4. So you might be able to suppress one, but you couldn't get all of them. And then if the gunner, the person with the weapon, and a lot of them used the Russian, they call it a burp gun, kind of a submachine gun like a Thompson with the canister. If he got hit, then the number 2 gunner would get promoted. He would then pick up the weapon. And frequently, you knew that you had knocked out a gunner because at night, what you see, you don't see the person, but you see the flame coming out of the barrel. So you fire just below the flame. And you can tell sometimes the finger's still on the trigger, the flame would go up in the air. But then in a short time, you'd get fire from the same place. You say, wait a minute. Then you realize their tactic that, and then if the number 2 guy got hit, the number 3 guy got promoted. And along, I guess there was a pay increase also. And he became the gunner. The Chinese were excellent, very well disciplined. They were superior soldiers. The Korean soldiers tended to be quite masculine. They would attack a hill, and even when it became apparent they were not going to be successful, they would continue. So they would get wiped out. The Chinese were smarter. When they ran into serious firepower, they would withdraw, but then they would circle, because normally in a firefight, you would form like circling the wagons. You would circle around the military crest of a hill. Now, every hill has 2 types of crest. One is a topographical crest. That's the top. But frequently, when you're at the top of the hill, you can't see the bottom. So you have to go to a point at which you're still up high, but you can see the bottom. So you can see people coming. That's called the military crest. So in a patrol, you would form on the military crest so you could observe them, because we also had night vision. I always had a night vision apparatus on my carbine. It was pretty inefficient. The batteries didn't last very long. And now they're more sophisticated. But you could at least see movement. And I think I make reference to it in that little paper on the firefight. Sometimes you wouldn't throw a grenade because you weren't sure, but you throw a rock. And when that thuds in the night, you think it's a grenade, so you can cause movement. And that way someone will betray their position. And then you know where to throw the real grenade. The hills were between 9,000 meters and 300 meters. 300 meter, 500 meter, they were like anthills, unless someone's on top trying to prevent you to get up. And then it becomes, as in T-Bone Hill, became a problem. As a company commander of a rifle company, I remember my first company, I had a 1,500 meter company front, and I felt that I was God. I could call up armor tanks to fire. I could call in airstrikes. I was responsible for that 1,500 meters, and no one was going to come through us. And that was the feeling. I also visited every person in my company. I made sure they took off their boots, they massaged their feet, they got dry socks. You don't know what a premium dry socks are in the military when it's raining and it's cold and you're worried about frostbite and things like that. We had a lot of casualties because of frostbite. I also did something that a lot of the guys didn't like. I shaved every day. To me, shaving was a matter of discipline. It was taking care of your appearance, being proud of your appearance, and being clean shaven. I know that those ideas have changed over time. I know they did in Vietnam. I have no problem with that. But for me, it was a matter of discipline. The one thing you need to have in combat is discipline. And the one story that has never been told, is the heroism of the combat medic. The combat medic would go into a firefight with a medical bag and a stretcher and no weapon. And when someone calls during a firefight, no matter how hot the action, the medic would go there. I make reference to the sound of popcorn. In a firefight, that's what it sounds like you're in a cauldron and the popcorn is popping, but it's real ammunition. And the bullets are flying by and they're breaking the sound barrier. Except the only one doesn't, it's a 22. That's why, by the way, 22s are used a lot for sniper fire because they don't break the sound barrier. It's a minor point, but in a firefight, you can hear the bullets whizzing around. The advantage we had with the Chinese using the Russian burp gun is that the rate of fire was so fast that the weapon would raise and they would fire over your head. I always wondered why they didn't turn it on its side and give it its head. It sounded like canvas ripping when they fired it. That's how fast it was. But they were not accurate. Of course, I spent time in the MASH. The MASH I went to wasn't quite as exciting as the movie version of MASH, but they did good work. And I remember the first thing, you go into one, and the first thing they do is they put you on this huge X-ray. They X-ray your wounds, and then you go in and they give you an IV, and then you start getting something to make you sleepy. And then when they're ready for you, they wheel you into a room the size of a football field where they had partitions, kind of like the, what do they call the little, cubicles. And each one is an operating room, and they used ether, and you start counting backwards from 100. Then you wake up and the operation's over. And I remember the first time I was on board a train, and I looked down, and the fellow beneath me had no arms and one leg. And I was thinking how fortunate I was, because my wounds were flesh wounds. And without bone involvement, which was a blessing. Then one time I was angry because I had never ridden in a helicopter. And when I was unconscious, and I was told that I was transported to the hospital by helicopter. And I said, damn it, I wanted to have that experience, but I didn't. Anyway, the tough thing as a company commander was something I was not prepared for, and that was writing letters to the family whose sons were killed in action. And I was fortunate because there was a Catholic priest who would come up and bring candles. Candles are a premium when that's your only illumination at night. And I told him that I had great difficulty in formulating a letter, and he was able to assist me in writing a letter to the parents whose son was killed in action. It's something that I have since recommended. Guidance is provided, and assistance is provided. I don't think it's any secret that in most cases you relate to the parents that their son was killed in action and died quickly. In point of fact, that wasn't always the case, but you wanted to provide some modicum of comfort. It was bad enough losing, and so you didn't really go into the details of the action. But I make a little reference to it in the short comments on a firefight where you talk about someone. There are a lot, and there's humor in combat. We had one fellow when I first got there in my platoon who had a capacity to consume alcohol, which was unheard of. So he was called the Monster. So once a month, the Army would give me as platoon leader 6 bottles of whiskey, primarily Canadian Club. And after a firefight, we would meet to discuss lessons learned among those who were wounded. And I would open a bottle. But we always made the monster sit on the end because we knew that once he got the bottle, no one was going to get it away from him. And there would be nothing left. So, monster, get on the end. Oh, yes, sir. And anyway, everybody would take a swig, except the monster, and he would finish it off. Stupid things that happen like that. I think the big thing is remembering that that this is a temporary time in your life, that you are a civilized person, and we did not tolerate abuse of prisoners of war. I know there is anger, great anger. One time, the Chinese took over an outpost and took one of our guys prisoner. And they took him back to Keybone Hill. And he was tied to a tree, and they used him for bayonet practice. And we could see this with our binoculars. And the fighting became a little more ferocious on our part after that. But it's a different mindset, and I don't want. I'm glad that my son did go in the military, but I'm glad my grandchildren haven't. I don't want them to experience that. They don't need the baggage that I have. There are times, it's almost like a movie in your head.
Hi.
Hi, well, the wounded warrior is back.
My wife had chest pains yesterday, went to the hospital, no heart attack.
Good.
This is
And
I'm married to
Christine,
Paul. Nice to meet you,
Nice
Paul.
to meet you.
No,
Thanks.
you don't
Third.
need that. That's okay.
Thank you for letting us
Glad to hear from
I'm glad you're okay. Oh, you sound like my niece. She sounds like Sherry.
now, by the way, Mary Lou is a colonel's daughter, so I married the colonel's daughter. Ironically, at the time,
You knew what you were getting, right? You knew what you were getting?
Oh, yeah, I did.
That's good.
Okay, I'm going to disappear, but nice to meet you.
I
Nice to
told
meet you
her
too.
father I'm getting out of the Army. I said, I got what I came for. That was 63 years ago. But as I was saying, that when you go through the trauma of a war, you come out with baggage. And I used to tell people that there's a movie in my head, and something will trigger that, and that movie will start almost relentlessly, frame by frame, every second. And I could tell you, I'm 87 years old. I could tell you every firefight that I was in, what happened. I don't want my grandchildren to have that in their memory bank. And most wars, World War II, I think was inevitable. We didn't have any choice. But to be very frank, I don't know of any other war that I would think was so essential that we had to fight it. I think if Roosevelt had lived, he wanted Vietnam to be independent. The French insisted that when World War II was over, Vietnam became a colony again, with which they could exploit. Roosevelt was against it. And when he died, the French prevailed. And that's why you had Dien Bien Phu. That's why Ho Chi Minh became a communist. And that's why they tried to defeat the French. And then we walked into that. Sad. I don't blame the people that fought. I blame the people in government. The people who fought the wrong time, the wrong place, they did the same thing that happened during the American Revolution and every war America had ever fought. Their country called and said, we want you to go, we want you to serve. They answered the call, and I respect that. But I really have a hard time justifying most of the wars in which we've been involved. I think war is simply an overt means of diplomacy. And when you can't talk anymore, you fight. And it's a sad thing. And I'm sorry.
What do you think this generation today, this year, can learn from your experiences? You mentioned that the Korean War is a forgotten war. What should we remember?
I think we should remember that in keeping with the American tradition throughout our history, that there are young men and women who were called by their country to serve, and they answered the call because of a feeling of patriotism, because of a feeling for their country. We need to respect that. And also, we need to find people in government who will explore every opportunity to prevent wars from happening. We need to do a better job. We need to help with resources to where we can, so that we don't have this breakdown in diplomacy. But I don't blame those who answer the call. I blame, like, McNamara's comment after the Vietnam War. He was Secretary of Defense, and he indicated there were things he could have done that he didn't. And I lost all respect for him. We have a wall in Washington with 58,000 names on it. You could have done something to prevent that, and you didn't. But the young people, they're called, they feel a sense. That's why when I say World War II, when we had the attack on Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt wanted to help Britain in World War II in Europe, and the Japanese made it easy. We had a lot of isolationists, but that ended the feeling when we were attacked. And America, as a proud country, is always going to respond to something that they consider some act of betrayal or treachery. They will. Any other questions?
Just a few. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'll just ask one more.
I'm not sure if
Do you think that, was your experience that Korea was two separate cultures? Do you think they're two separate cultures now, or that they'll ever be reunited? They're still in civil war. there's simply the ceasefire, do you think that Korea will ever be just Korea? Or do you think it's always going to be North and South Korea from this point on?
I think because of the nature of the leadership in North Korea, I would love to see Korea united. But Nam-il, I think, was certifiably non-compass, and apparently the genes have transferred to his son, and now his grandson. But you know, I don't know that we haven't done everything that we could. The scars are still, you know, we're still at war with North Korea and China. The war never ended. Stop with an armistice or a truce. We need to put those things to rest. I always feel there are alternatives that are worth exploring to lessen the tensions between countries. We're having a lot of problems with Iran and the nuclear thing. You know, nuclear weapons, that's another form of insanity. And the example I use is one country says, well, I've only got 3 nuclear weapons, and America's got, say, thousands. But if you're sitting on the edge of a swimming pool filled with gasoline, how many matches do you need? So I look for enlightened leadership who will find a way to prevent wars. We don't need American young people going to war and coming home with the baggage that you come home with. I would tell the veterans, now there's a greater emphasis in recognizing PTSD. But my comment is that if you have experienced combat, you have PTSD. And if you don't, you aren't paying attention. You come home with it. And it's just like my experience with the VA. When I went over the top of a desk, it took less than a minute. And if that guy hadn't thrown his hands up and said, whoa, stop, I'm sorry, I don't know what I would have done. I might have thrown him out the window. We're on the 3rd floor. I was furious. And I didn't even know why. And I walked down there. You know, one comment he made. He says, you got to be born again. I said, what does that mean? He said, well, it's like in the Bible. And I thought about that. And I said, he's right. I have to change the way I'm thinking. And he said, you can't solve the problems. He says, I saw your record. I know what you've done. You can't solve the problems the way you did in combat. And that helped me, believe it or not. But I had to be resourceful enough to work through it myself. Now they have counseling and programs. Thank goodness they do. But you know, something happens that people don't talk about. The way we used to call the Koreans the gooks. It's a pejorative nickname. I'm sure that in Iraq and Afghanistan, they have pejorative names for the natives. You know, Eleanor Roosevelt said it best. You can't keep a person in the gutter without getting down there with them. And I think that how you treat people when you're in that situation impacts on you and your self-image and how you interface with other people. So there are lessons that need to be taught about human relationships. There's a lot that I like about political correctness. I rail against it as an old man sometimes, but I also recognize the value that it has. That you show a little more respect to other people in your relationships. And you're not so quick to put labels or call names. And I think that's a good thing, because that's kind of the way we can survive together more effectively. And pardon me, I'm just getting over pneumonia, and I'm still coughing a bit. But the doctor says it'll take a month, but I figure, okay, so if I have 30 days, I'm improving 3% a day. So I'm about 36% right now. So I'm really coming back, feeling good. But as you can tell, the experience that happened in 1951 and 52 never really have gone completely away. They're still there. And that's unfortunate. But what helped me was I married a good woman. And she has been a powerful force in my life. And again, 63 years. And but I think that two people, a married couple, they can stage their attack on the world. I think particularly for guys that without that kind of support, life can be tougher, can be more difficult. I remember the best man at my wedding had been married before. In fact, there was opposition to his being my best man because he had been divorced. But he was my best man, and I stayed with him. And he said, I'm going to make it simple for you. He says, you marry the wrong one and it's hell. You marry the right one and it's heaven. He said, the second time I married the right one and it's heaven. Those relationships help. It took a lot to bring me out of my shell. The things that I've talked to you about today, I would never have talked to you about before. The things that I wrote in that little paper on firefight, I would not have shared with anyone. So over time, and also being a Christian has helped, because I can't do it alone. I need my higher power. I need my faith. And it helps me over the rough spots. And it's made a difference in my life. But and I appreciate you being here because your interest in the subject. Something I hope will come out of this that you can share that maybe will be some little nugget that someone who hears about it or reads about it will be able to internalize and say, you know, I understand that. Maybe I can be a better person by doing this or doing that. That's why I spend time mentoring my grandchildren. We talk about things. Because they're guys, I'm a little more earthy with them. But I'm pretty earthy with my daughter too. But I think it's good to be able to be a mentor, to share, not to glorify, and not to glamorize. There's nothing glamorous about war. War is filth. War is horrible. It's bitterness, and it's misdirected hatred, and I mean, what does it take to kill someone you don't even know? I tell people one of the biggest mistakes I made was the first person that I knew I killed. To see if he had any maps, I went through his pockets, and I found a billfold with a picture of a woman and 2 children. And I said, I've never forgotten that. I wish I could, but I can't. You don't want those indelible experiences. You want them to be something else. You're still going to have, life's not going to be easy. You're still going to have to struggle. There's still going to be little disagreements and unhappiness. But at least you can work your way through it. But there's something final when you put a bullet in someone's head. There's no more communication. And you don't forget that. You wish you could, but you don't. So we don't need that. We don't need the wars. And we don't need the post-traumatic stress syndrome, because it's real. And that's why I preach to people. You know, there's a certain euphoria when people come home and everybody's glad to see them. And I always make sure that I get together with the individual, man or woman, and just remind them, you're not the same person. You're going to have anger and you won't understand it. Please, call the vet center. Call me anytime, 24 hours a day, and I'll come over, we'll talk. Some of the killings that are going on now, sadly, are veterans who didn't get the kind of help they need. We seem to have this periodically, every week, someone is killing someone. Yeah, I don't mind shotguns for hunting if you want to hunt waterfowl for food or things like that. It's funny, I came back and I was invited to go deer hunting, and I declined. And the fellow said, "Why don't you want to go?" I said, "Well, when they arm the deer with rifles, then I'll go. Then it's fair." But I do like to shoot some birds, because I like to put them in the pot and around the holidays. But when you have a gun, I have my General Officer's .45 that I keep. I just, we need to do something to find a way to solve our problems other than gun violence. As I said, there's something so final about it, tragic. And as the mayor of my city, I remember one time we had a break-in in this home. So I told my wife, go in the bathroom, get the cell phone, and lock the door. And she said, what are you going to do? I said, I'll be here. So I got my pistol. I turned the light on in the hall, turned the light off in the bedroom, and I took a position. And if anyone had come into that light, I was prepared to kill him. Then the police showed up and they said, is he armed? And my wife on the phone said, yes. They said, tell him to put the gun down. And I did. And I came to the door and there were 4 or 5 policemen there. The person had gone. And I said, you know, I was prepared to shoot, but I'm so glad I didn't have to. And that's kind of the feeling that I get when I see things going on. Anyway, we're far afield of the Korean War, but you see, these things have become a part of me. And they have changed how I look at things. But I think, as I put in there, when I was young, I thought differently about things. But I have thought with regret a lot about the firefights that I was been in and things that happened. And it's excess baggage. You have any more questions?
I want to be respectful of your time, and thank you. I feel like we could have this conversation for many more hours, but I just want to thank you for serving our country and continuing long past the Korean War, which we have spoken about today.
By the way, it's a mismatch.
Thank you. That's how this professor gives us our test notes as well. It's just words and phrases that mostly mean things to him.
Well, thank you also.